Welcome to the Steering Change Podcast, navigating through the commercial transportation industry in Alberta and beyond, powered by the Alberta Motor Transport Association. Here's your host, Doug Walton.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Steering Change Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Walton, and I'm excited to have you here with us for part 3 of the Road to Wellness series. This 4-part series takes a closer look at the unique challenges our drivers face while out on the road. In our previous episode, we explored the impact of diet and exercise on their well-being, and we also learned that even small changes to eating habits and combining them with a little bit more physical activity in our daily routines can have a positive impact to our overall health. The key takeaway, better nutrition and a bit more exercise can not only reduce the risk of injury, but also promote long-term health and wellness. Today, we are tackling a topic that affects everyone, fatigue. We will be learning from industry experts on how fatigue impacts commercial drivers, and we'll take a deep dive into the importance of sleep and fatigue management for our commercial drivers. To start things off, I'm excited to welcome our guest for today's podcast. He is a fatigue management specialist with the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance and a recognized expert in the field of fatigue management. It is my pleasure to introduce Rodolfo Giacoman to the Steering Change Podcast. Rodolfo, welcome, my friend, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, Doug.
Also joining me as my co-host today is AMTA's Industry Advisor, Safety and Compliance, and one of the smartest guys I've had the pleasure of working with, Mr. Dave Elniski. Welcome back, Dave.
Yeah, happy to be here again, Doug. Good to see you again too, Rodolfo.
Likewise.
Rodolfo, it's a pleasure to have you on the Steering Change Podcast today. Although we haven't had a chance to meet in person, we had a chance to talk before, and it's great to connect with you again. I've had the opportunity to hear you share a bit about the work that you do for the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, or the CVSA for short. And it's clear that you have a deep passion for and a connection to the work that you do. So to start, I just wanted to thank you for being here. And I know my co-host and I are really looking forward to the conversation with you today. And speaking about my co-host, Dave Elniski, you're certainly no stranger to the Steering Change Podcast, and I thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the role at the AMTA?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Dave Elniski, he, they, and I work for the Alberta Motor Transport Association as their advisor in safety and compliance. So my work involves typically helping carriers, companies, anybody with a fleet, safety professionals, drivers, really anybody who reaches out, just to help with their questions related to both occupational health and safety, and then transportation-specific safety at the federal and provincial levels, also including like US DOT compliance as well. So if you are a carrier, you operate a fleet of any kind, regardless of the size, your operations in Alberta or you're Alberta-based, we're just here to help you navigate the complex rules of safety regulations. I started in transportation as a trucker. I did long-haul flatbed work for a number of years before I got into fleet safety management. Outside of my role, I also do research in this area too. I'm a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan in public health, and also an active Army Reserve soldier where they still let me drive trucks every now and then. So that's kind of my background anyways.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Dave. And Rodolfo, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and what brought you to the CVSA, and just chat a little bit about that with us.
Absolutely, Doug. I've been involved with CVSA for 30 years. Not as an employee only the last 3 years, but before as a sponsor, associate member, contractor, consultant. CVSA has been the denominator throughout my career in transportation. I grew up in a family where my father had a small trucking business. He had about a 10 fleet company, and I got to do some maintenance while I was a kid. So some of the life that drivers and the families of motor carriers go through firsthand. And I also happened to experience what happened when one of my dad's drivers fell asleep at the wheel and totaled one of the 2 trucks that my dad had at the end of his trucking business, because he went into a farm venture and started winding down the trucking business and just kept 2 trucks, and one of them totaled because of a fatigue crash. And so that was a bit harsh, and it made a big dent on my memories of what fatigue can do. So it is a very severe and important factor to consider in your operations as a motor carrier. I went into consulting for the Department of Transportation, the U.S. Department of Transportation, for almost 2 decades. And we were a company doing the commercial driver database access, both in all the U.S. jurisdictions, as well as connecting to Canada's interprovincial record exchange for the province's records on drivers, and to Mexico's federal government database, because that's who issues the CDLs down there. And so we were the gateway into the CDL for law enforcement in the U.S. and operated that on behalf of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And when the North American Fatigue Management Program was born back in 2013, I was immediately drawn into it, and I started a consulting career as a fatigue management specialist, as a consultant. I had my own business. It was alertness.pro, and I was a general manager training and consulting with motor carriers, training drivers and their instructors and dispatchers and so on. And when the North American Fatigue Management Program was housed in the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance in CVSA, then I was honored to get the opportunity to operate, administer the program, and promote it, which is what we're doing now. And I'm very pleased. CVSA is very well known for promoting and enforcing safety. And this program has to do very little with enforcement, but a lot to do with safety. And I'm very pleased for the opportunity that you, Doug, and Dave have given me to talk about that today.
Well, we're certainly happy, again, to have you here and share your overall level of expertise with us. So I'll get started. We'll just dive right into it. Could you explain to us and the listeners, what is fatigue management and how does that differ from like hours of service management?
That's a great question, Doug, because most in the industry think that all you got to do to stay alert on the road is comply with hours of service. And that is one of the factors that affect your fatigue, or your alertness, which is the time that you spend on a task. But the state of alertness has both internal factors, which are your supply, your own supply that you bring of alertness, what you supply with your alertness. And those internal factors have to do with your circadian rhythm, the time of the day, how long you slept the day before, your health, your well-being, your genes, even your mood, the medicines that you're taking, any stimulants, and so on. So those are internal factors. None of those have to do with time on task. The time on task is one of those that are external factors that demand your alertness. So when you talk about time on task is one of those factors, but you also have how complex the task is, how monotonous. If you're on a very lonely and straight highway, that's going to tire you, even if you slept well the day before. Has nothing to do with, hours of service or even with your sleep. And then there's environmental factors. If you're going through rain or snow or different environmental factors, the vibration in the cabin, all of those different factors affect your fatigue. So you need a comprehensive way to deal with fatigue and not only with hours of service. Hours of service is just one thing. And hours of service, what they do is give you, as a driver, the opportunity to rest. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be resting. That doesn't mean that you're aligning the hours that you're actually working with your circadian rhythm. So there's more into it than just complying with hours of service.
Those hours of service is really just the guideline, but there's so many factors involved in fatigue is what you're saying. And so what does a good fatigue management program look like for a carrier? What would you suggest there?
Well, the North American Fatigue Management Program is very clear that motor carriers, to manage fatigue, they need two big things. One of them is a safety culture where alertness and all the precautions like taking care of your sleep, taking care of your health, and ensuring that anyone who gets on the wheel is fully alert is part of the company's values. Not a priority, a value. Values don't change. You can't put them aside for a while. every time you go out, just like you get dressed every day before you go out, you need to get your sleep, your rest, your wellness before you go out. And that's part of a good safety culture in a company. So that's one of the things that you need, the safety culture. The other big component is a fatigue risk management system. And that system will allow the motor carrier to identify the risk, assess the risk, how likely it is to happen and how severe, and come up with countermeasures to those that need to be dealt with those that are highest risk and that are more likely to occur. Implement the countermeasures and then evaluate whether those countermeasures are working. And the NAFMP recommends that as part of your FRMS, the fatigue risk management system, you have at least 3 different things in place. And these are processes that can be predictive, proactive, and reactive. And one of them is sound scheduling practices. There's biomathematical models that will try to come up with hours that reflect the driver's circadian rhythm, maybe include routing so that there are scheduled stops where the driver can park and rest and things like that. So sound scheduling practices is one of the most recommended things that you should have as a motor carrier. Second is a sleep disorder screening program or a sleep disorder management program. Why is that important? Because in your operation, the most susceptible drivers to have fatigue are those who have a sleep disorder. And sleep disorders are very treatable, like obstructive sleep apnea. It's a relatively easy fix. All you got to do is identify that you have it, and then you get treatment. There's different options for treatment, and there you go. Within 24 hours, you can be back on the road. That's the second one. And the third one is fatigue monitoring technologies, which usually serve as your last line of defense. In case, even if you did everything else, even if you had that safety culture, even if you had good schedules and good routes, and you had monitor for sleep disorders, which are very important things to make sure everybody that is operating is fully alert, then a fatigue management technology will monitor and detect it and prevent a crash. So that's safety culture, fatigue risk management system with sound scheduling practices, a sleep disorder management program, and fatigue monitoring technologies.
So it really starts from the top, is what you're saying, in terms of your fatigue management program and adopted company-wide. And I know that there is definitely a link between health and wellness and fatigue. And you talked about sleep disorder, and it's funny, I just was diagnosed with sleep apnea, and I had no idea. I don't fit the mold per se, is what I thought, right? And I'm not overweight. I'm not a driver anymore, but I realized that I was having difficulty sleeping. When I got tested, I realized I stopped breathing 23.5 times an hour. And my sleep was very, very poor. And I wake up, I had the brain fog, not feeling rested. It took me a little while to get going every day. So I can imagine how that really has an impact on drivers when, they get out of bed from the bunk and they're expected to flip over to on-duty status and start driving right away. And maybe they spent the 10 hours in the bunk, but they really didn't get the rest that they needed. So I really like that. And I know that the sleep disorder treatment is one of those components to those risk management programs that you talk about, and I think it's an area that we really need to bring more awareness to. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So why should carriers implement a fatigue management program, and what tools are available and what resources are there to help them guide them through that?
That's the key question. Why? And when I talk about fatigue and to any large gathering of motor carriers, they always tell me, well, we don't want to crash. We don't want to be exposed to the liability and to all the different suffering that comes with a crash, fatalities, injuries, extreme damages, and lawsuits. I always emphasize having a fatigue management program in your organization is crucial to operate efficiently. If you don't have one, if you don't have a fatigue management program in place, you're leaving money on the table because your drivers are not going to be operating at their maximum capacity. If you're tired, you're not going to be fuel efficient. You're going to be accelerating drastically and wasting brakes, maintenance costs because you're going to be braking erratically. Maybe you miss a turn because fatigue and alertness are not like an on and off switch. Your alertness starts to degrade like if it were a spectrum. And so you may not even realize that you're tired, but your perception starts to deteriorate and your performance starts to deteriorate. So you're going to miss that turn. You're going to miss the exit. You're going to accelerate more and brake harder and maybe have an incident, maybe get a violation. So having a tired driver is expensive. It's a bigger cost than it should be. So having alert drivers that are practicing the keys to wellness, that are getting their sufficient sleep, that are operating in a culture, like you said, where from the top, everybody knows in the organization that we are supposed to report when we're tired so that they can replace us or give us the chance to take a break and rest so that we can deliver either goods or people safely. So that's why you need to implement a fatigue management program and practice fatigue management to make more money and to avoid all the suffering that fatigue crashes bring with them. Fatigue crashes are very severe because drivers are not braking. So a fatigue crash is going to be an ugly and costly crash.
No, and that's a great point. And you don't really think about it from that perspective when you talk about expense to fatigue, right? We know in trucking, our margins are very, very small. Everything has to go really well to make money on that load. And when you point out, if you have a driver that's fatigued behind the wheel and he takes the wrong turn and he has to travel extra kilometers that don't really need to be there, or he's making or she's making mistakes and running into things or just making poor decisions just because of that fatigue, it really affects the bottom line on that P&L. And that's a very good point. And moving on to more of the driver's side, and this is where I'll pass it over to our co-host Dave to talk a little bit more about how fatigue and what the drivers need to be doing as well. So Dave, I'll pass it over to you.
Alrighty. No, thank you, Doug. Thank you, Rodolfo. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your knowledge so far. There's a lot to this topic, and kind of thought that it would make sense to, we've done a really good job addressing carrier side of things, but let's maybe shift gears here, change lanes, whatever other trucking puns we can work in, to shift our focus to the drivers now. So I guess the first question I'd have, in your opinion, what should drivers know about fatigue, like beyond the hours of service rules? So you've got the hours of service. What is the next thing they should really know?
That's a great question, Dave. The drivers need to know what the NAFMP calls, the North American Fatigue Management Program calls, the 5 keys to wellness. And I like to start with mindfulness because that's where each driver can take stock of what they're doing and take a breath, take a break, and try to understand their body and how the different things that are happening in their lives is creating a stress. The common denominator of these 5 keys to wellness that I'm going to be talking about is that they're going to reduce the physical and the mental stress that drivers have to deal with, because we all experience stress, but commercial motor vehicle drivers have it worse. It's a very lonely job. You're alone. And here in the United States, last year the Surgeon General declared about the dangers of the loneliness epidemic, because personal relationships, which is the second factor that I wanted to talk about, the second key to wellness, are very important. And maintaining those warm relationships should be a key task for drivers, especially when they're on the road, trying to stay in touch as much as they can, texting or making phone calls, staying in touch with whomever they have, partners, spouses, coworkers, friends. They need a network. The key for that is that a warm relationship is a great stress regulator. Just like when you meditate and take stock of what you're doing in your life and center, take a deep breath so that you bring down your blood pressure by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which regulates your heart rate and your blood pressure and all those good things. It's the same way when you have somebody to talk to that you trust, that you enjoy talking with. So, first of all, start with mindfulness, practice it. It's not just for monks, it's for all of us who have a lot of stress and we need to calm down. Second, the warm relationships. Third, no surprise, nutrition. You need to get your macronutrients and your micronutrients. You need vitamins, minerals, your carbs, your fats, your protein, your fiber, and water. Everything else, you need to try to stay away from it. So nutrition is very important. Make sure that you get the nutrients that your body needs to maintain itself in peak performance. Just like you go to the gas station and fill up your rig with the best fuel that you can get. Same for you. Make sure you're getting the fuel that your body needs. Fourth, you gotta move, because movement is the best medicine to maintain the body. As we age, we start losing muscle. It's called sarcopenia. So the best way to stay as young as possible, even as we age, is to do resistance training to make sure that you retain or grow muscle, because it's going away naturally as we age. So moving is important, especially if you're in a profession where you're sitting most of the day as a driver is. And last but not least, sleep hygiene. Drivers need to understand how sleep works. What's the sleep architecture? Because you just don't go to sleep and then wake up. There's several things happening when you go to sleep. You got to go through, you start with light sleep, and then you go into deep sleep. Then you go back to light sleep, and then you go into REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep. Each of these stages make one cycle. And drivers and everybody else, we need between 4 and 6 of these cycles per night. Each cycle takes about 90 minutes. That's the sleep architecture. Drivers need to understand that so they understand when it's best to take naps, why it's important if they wake up in the middle of their sleep period that they go back to sleep, because at the end of each of these sleep cycles, when you go into REM sleep, you can have arousals, whether you realize it or not. Sometimes we realize it because we want to pee and we need to go to the restroom. Yeah, go ahead, go pee, but don't start a party, and don't get distracted with your mobile device or whatever. Go back to sleep and catch all the other sleep cycles that your body actually needs. So those are the 5 keys to wellness that drivers need to maintain themselves in the most alert capacity. But that's not the only thing. Those are key items that they need to understand and have knowledge of. But they also need to be trained to recognize when they are tired, the signs of fatigue, instead of relying on their own perception of how they're fatigued. A lot of drivers will say, well, I've been driving for 7 hours. I can easily drive 30 or 45 more minutes. And that's when you crash. You need to look for objective signs of fatigue, not subjective. It's not about opinions. It's about, are you yawning? Are you wiggling? Is your head bobbling? Are you deviating from your lane? Do you have to do some jerk movements? Is the podcast that you're listening to or the music that you're listening is not satisfying you? You're changing channel, changing playlist? Is the heater or the AC not at the right temperature? You're wiggling and you're not comfortable the way you're sitting. Those are all different signs that you need to start to stop down and take a break. The worst of those signs is a micronap. If you realize and you're lucky enough to survive a micronap, that means your body is so sleep deprived that it's taking the sleep that it needs from you, whether you let it or not. And a lot can happen during those micro sleeps. So there's the knowledge and training that drivers need, and it is available. If they go to the nafmp.org, it's the website of the North American Fatigue Management Program, they can take Module 3, which is it will explain each of these concepts And in addition to those, it also has strategies, general strategies for managing fatigue while at home, while on the road, those who happen to do night driving, those who have changing schedules and changing time zones, and so on. So I encourage your listeners to check out nafmp.org for North American Fatigue Management Program. And these are free courses. This program was created by the province of Alberta, the province of Quebec, Transport Canada, and the U.S. Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. This program was tested with real drivers from your provinces and from the states, and the results are unquestionable. Managing fatigue saves lives and improves your productivity.
No, I appreciate that, Rodolfo. We'll make sure that link as well at www.nafmp.org is in our show notes. So a quick recap then. So really, I mean, so the 5 elements you talked about then, we talked about mindfulness and also awareness, nutrients, getting the right food, relationships, exercise, and then actually paying attention to how we're sleeping itself. Might have got the order wrong there, but I think those are the 5, right?
That's correct.
Awesome.
I really like the relationship one. You don't think about that, but that human connection, how important it is, especially as a driver when you're in the truck for miles a week and you don't have those connections. So it brings me back to my days in operations where we always wanted to have that open door policy for those drivers so that they did have those people to talk to when they came in. And sometimes they didn't have time to go home and see their families. They came in and just needed a few minutes to chat and connect with someone. And to your point, I didn't realize how important those moments were with those drivers to help build those connections. So thanks for bringing that up. Sorry to jump in there, Dave.
No.
And sorry for interrupting, but the studies have shown, multiple studies, including the longest one on longevity and wellness from Harvard, the GRANT study. The single most important thing you can do for longevity and well-being is practice warm relationships. And for me, it was a surprise as well when I learned it. Wow. You would think it's non-smoking or maintaining a good blood pressure or, exercising or anything else. And I was so surprised how important through all these different studies, multi-year and different studies done, they have shown that that's the single most important thing we can do to ensure our wellness.
No, that is really good to know. And the next question I was going to ask was kind of getting into the science of sleep, but you've started to get into it with sleep hygiene, the discussions there, because I guess there's the carrier component, there's the training they would provide. Drivers also do have the ability, independent of their company, though, to seek a lot of this information themselves. I mean, if we look at how a long haul driver typically sleeps in a sleeper, I had a period of my time where I mostly lived in the truck. I don't know, is there low-hanging fruit perhaps from a sleep science or sleep hygiene perspective? Maybe the first couple of things that a driver could look at in their immediate environment, in their sleeper cab, whatever it might be, maybe the first couple of things to tackle.
Yeah, and sleep hygiene, it's actually very simple. It's pretty straightforward. You practice sleep hygiene if you're aware of the 2 drivers of sleep. One of them is your circadian rhythm, and the other one is the homeostatic sleep drive, which is how long. It's a timer. It's not a clock like the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is a clock, and your homeostatic sleep drive is a timer that measures how long you've been awake. And those 2 things are very important for drivers to know. And there's many little things that they can do, a lot of low-hanging fruit, if you understand how they work. The circadian rhythm is basically about managing energy, all sources of energy. You got to be aware that light, sound, temperature will affect whether you're going to be alert or whether you're going to be sleepy. The higher the sources of energy, you're going to be awake. And that's what resets the actual circadian clock. When you see the light, when you hear the noise, when your temperature rises, that's a sign to your body, hey, buddy, wake up. And when you start shutting down those sources of energy, it's a sign that you're supposed to go to rest and sleep. So drivers can easily make sure that they're not blocking sources of energy when they're supposed to be alert, and to block them when they're supposed to go to rest.
Okay.
How does that work with, say, I'm a night shift driver? I always travel through the night. So how does that rhythm now come into play when I don't see the light of day for the most part of my trip? How does that work with my rhythm?
Well, if you operate at night, you got to trick your body into thinking that at night you're supposed to be awake. And how do you do that? Well, you got to bring up all the sources of energy. Some cabs are putting those red lights inside so that they're getting some light inside the cab instead of being all dark. Pump up the music, have some engaging conversations. And during the daylight, when you're supposed to go to sleep, you gotta simulate night. You gotta block all that light, or have eye shades, earplugs if you're in an area where there's sound going on, or have some white noise going on from your mobile device. Some motor carriers recommend drivers carry a fan. The fan will do a little bit of white noise and also bring down the temperature, which is also good because lower temperature is going to make you sleepy. So if you're driving at night, you got to trick your circadian rhythm into believing that night is day and day is night by managing the sources of energy, all of them, including food. When you go to sleep, you don't need a lot of food to go to sleep. That's why the recommendation is try to eat at least 3 or 4 hours before you go to bed, because otherwise the blood is going to be diverted to your gastric system instead of going to all the organs where it needs to do a lot of repair and rejuvenation. The other drive of sleep is, as I said earlier, the homeostatic sleep drive, and that's the accumulation of adenosine in the brain that makes you feel sleepy as we burn ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And I know it sounds a little, scientifically, but it's very important because when you take caffeine in any form, the caffeine will go to the receptors of adenosine in the brain, and it will block the signal from adenosine, meaning you're not going to feel tired. And that's good when you're supposed to be awake. But drivers need to understand that caffeine stays in the body about 8 hours after you ingest the caffeine. And so if you're driving during the day, you better should stop drinking caffeine, shortly after noon, like at 2 o'clock, maybe 3 p.m., depending on when you go to sleep, to allow for the caffeine to be metabolized out of your system. And then you are able to sense the adenosine receptors so that you can go in, not only fall asleep, because some people can fall asleep after a couple of espresso, but that doesn't mean that they're going to get to all the different stages of sleep and get the benefits. That's what, if you don't get that signal from the adenosine that you need to rest, you're not going to get the benefits of deep sleep in particular, because deep sleep clears the adenosine. It's part of that back and forth between getting tired and then getting ready to work. And sometimes when you have, when you sleep for 3 hours or so, you go through 2 of the sleep cycles and you wake up to pee, you feel like, oh, I feel rested. Damn, I can't go back to sleep. No, it just means that you clear enough adenosine so that you don't feel that you're tired anymore, but you're still at the lowest point of your circadian rhythm when you're supposed to be sleeping. So you shouldn't be driving at that time. And if you just relax, do some meditation, and you'll be able to fall back to sleep. It's what your body wants. That's why it's so important that drivers understand those 2 concepts of how the circadian rhythm works and how the homeostatic sleep drive works with the adenosine.
Sweet. Well, thank you very much. That's actionable. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It's something, that we all need to know. It's something that should be taught in kindergarten, I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
It's never too late, especially, when you're in a profession as crucial as this one. I have a lot of respect for drivers, and I think practicing alertness and managing their fatigue is good for their health, makes them happy, makes them stay longer at a motor carrier, because if the motor carrier cares for them, cares for their well-being, and lets them stop and rest when they need it, they're going to stay with the motor carrier longer, which is one of the big costs in this industry, retention cost and attrition. So It's a win-win.
Yeah, it goes back to your comment on a top-down approach to fatigue management and understanding, your driver that is going out that day, maybe he was, and if he's a night shift driver, maybe he's trying to sleep and the neighbor's cutting the grass all day long, or he didn't get the rest or she didn't get the rest, and showing up to work and saying, you know what, I'm not fit for duty. I didn't get the rest that I needed. I'm not going to be able to make the schedule, that is out in front of me here. And they need to be supported from frontline dispatch or the management that they made that decision to say, I'm not going to be fit. I'm not going to be safe. Please find another driver, and not feel the pressure to go. A long-lasting career in this business has taught me one thing: don't pressure people to do things that they just are not in a position to do. And that stop work is so important to support from an operation and management perspective, right from the top down. And if you don't, there's consequences to that. And we all want to stay away from those.
Absolutely, Doug. And we're talking about driver fatigue, but no one should place the entire burden of fatigue on the driver. Everybody involved in the supply chain needs to pitch in, including the driver's family. That's why the NAFMP has a module for families. It has one for brokers, receivers, and shippers. It has one for dispatchers, so that everybody that touches the schedule of the driver or has to do with the driver's schedule understands the principles of fatigue, and they are supportive. You're right on the money.
Well, appreciate that support. And, there is a number of key stakeholders. We know that, in terms of managing driver fatigue. And you mentioned shippers and receivers and brokers. And I know that some of the shipping companies that are now looking at private fleet, and they're adjusting schedules to make it, again, you talked about sound schedule practices, and they're looking at those schedules, making changes instead of saying, you know what, okay, this freight doesn't have to travel at night. It can go tomorrow during the day. It helps reduce that risk, and again, speaks to that, the driver retention piece. If we're working together with shippers and companies to provide better schedules for drivers that allow them to be a little safer on the road and allow them to have a better work-life balance, it's going to be a win-win for everybody. So,
and Doug, if I may add, motor carriers don't need to reinvent the wheel. Neither CVSA or the NAFMP recommend or endorse any vendor in particular, but there's a lot of solutions out there for scheduling, for trip routing, even for doing the testing and the treatment and monitoring of sleep disorders like the obstructive sleep apnea, and all these technologies that can help motor carriers operate more efficiently and safely. Use them. As part of the webinars that CVSA does, we've done a series with multiple vendors with different types of solutions. People are welcome at the same website that I mentioned earlier, nafmp.org. And there's some catalogs that motor carriers can look for specific solutions. But I would absolutely encourage motor carriers to take advantage of them so they don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Agreed.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, because that gives drivers something actionable to be able to do. That's kind of information I would have been able to put it to use for sure. Sheds some light on some experiences that I'm kind of thinking about now too, and things I could have done better.
Good.
All right. Well, gentlemen, there has been a lot of valuable information shared here today, and we'll be sure to add the links in our show notes to the great resources Rodolfo had mentioned earlier. And just winding things down a bit, we always like to provide an opportunity for some last words. And so with that said, Rodolfo, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Yeah, all of these things that the NAFMP teaches drivers is the kind of knowledge and skills that people with a lot of money who can afford a gym and a coach or a counselor to help them improve their life, that's the type of information that is here available to drivers. So take advantage of it. It's going to make you work better. It's going to improve your health. It's going to ensure that you have a successful career. It's going to make sure that you're happy working and enjoying your family, your friends. And it's all free. And nobody's asking you or mandating you to do it. It's your option. So please take advantage of it. Don't waste any more time.
Great points. And thank you so much for that. Dave, anything you'd like to add?
The only thing I would add is just I'm going to draw attention. So for carriers that might be listening in, management folks, anybody involved in carrier operations, sound scheduling practices. Yes, there might be within certain businesses, things that have to be done certain ways. There's business models that have certain demands. It just is what it is. But I really do encourage, though, to at least hear out alternative solutions. Don't immediately get defensive when whether a driver brings up a concern, whether you're a concern from a regulator, or whether you're listening to this podcast and thinking, well, there's no way I could do any of that in my business. Just take 30 seconds, stow that thought, and see if you can. And if you can't, maybe you can. And there's still things you can do to help. And there's still things that you can do to improve your fatigue management program while operating the way you're operating. But a lot of the time we do things because we do the things the way we do them. And that's really about all the logic behind it sometimes. So do at least hear out alternative solutions and consider things when you're running your business.
Great message, Dave. Yeah, great message. And we used to put a little saying on our whiteboard in the office, is that because we've always done it this way. And that was one thing that we always said, let's not always say because we've always done it this way. Let's look at ways to improve. And I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I just want to say thank you both for, again, joining us and sharing your valuable expertise. And thank you to your listeners for tuning into the Steering Change podcast. We really hope you found today's discussion insightful. Be sure to join us on our next episode, which is the fourth and final installment on our Road to Wellness series, where we'll be addressing an important topic that is often overlooked in our industry, and that is our mental health. So if you have any questions or comments about the Road to Wellness series or any other Steering Change episode, reach out to us on Instagram at AMTA_CA or LinkedIn and Facebook at Alberta Motor Transport Association. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of AMTA's Steering Change Podcast. The views expressed by guests of the Steering Change Podcast are their own and may not reflect the views of AMTA, its hosts, or sponsors. Do you have a question that you would like answered on an upcoming episode of the Steering Change Podcast? We want to hear from you. To submit a question to the Steering Change mailbag, hit up our DMs on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram with the hashtag Steering Change, and your question will be answered either live on the podcast or by one of our SMEs here at AMTA. We ask that you share this episode with those in your network that could benefit from what we discussed today, and make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform so you can be notified when future episodes are released. You can learn more about us and our mission by visiting www.amta.ca. Now get out there and have a safe day.